Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. If you weren't here, I mentioned earlier that the presenter, Pedro, had a death in the family just a couple of days ago and couldn't be here. And so I quickly had to scrape up my, find my tuning for performance presentation that I gave last year. So if you were here last year, or if you were in Denver last year, and you heard this presentation before, hopefully maybe I'll have something in here that you didn't catch last time or something like that. But I do see a lot of new faces, so hopefully there'll be something here for you. I'm going to be talking about performance, how that relates to Expression Engine, how that relates to Google PageSpeed, and why it's important and stuff like that. I only got to rehearse it once since I found out I was giving it again, and it's been a year. So if I stumble a little bit and have to remember what I was trying to say, bear with me. So I am TJ. I am the owner of Buzzing Pixel LLC. That is something I started in 2015. And it's been quite a ride. It's been a lot of fun and very challenging. I am the father of 4 children and have a lovely wife. That's my family. I have been working with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and PHP in some form or fashion since around 2003. I was working my way up to senior developer at Caddis Interactive, which is now Lewis Communication. I built those websites, although I don't think at this time Easton Hunting is the website I built anymore. My current work, since this is from 2017, is a little out of date, but I do work on all those. And of course, I build add-ons like Executive, Ansel, Treasury, Construct, and Template Sync is kind of going away in favor of rolling something into Executive, but that's in the future. So what we're going to be covering today is why website performance is important. So we're going to talk a little bit about why you should care about website performance. We're going to talk about how to get Expression Engine to perform well, templating things, and just things you should avoid or do in Expression Engine. How to get performance out of your server. And again, some of that was covered a little bit in the Nexus presentation very well by Josh Ward, but I'm going to be approaching it from a little different angle. And then PageSpeed best practices. So let's go ahead and dive right in on why speed and performance are important and why you should care. So for me, a well-performing website is about user experience. And part of user experience is being able to access a website and the services it provides quickly and easily and without having to wait on server load times and server response and stuff like that. Because nobody has ever said, I really love waiting on websites to load. Literally nobody has ever said that. And here's the thing about slow sites, okay? After about 4 seconds, you're going to really start losing people. The people who came to your website to see something, or your client's website to see something, they're going to start going away after 4 seconds. And many studies have shown that that number of people who, after 4 seconds, when they're waiting on your site to load, many studies have shown that that is 1 out of 4 people will leave. Google found that by slowing, and this is my research from 2017, Google found that slowing search results by only 0.4 of a second, just 0.4 of a second, reduced the number of searches by 8 million a day. Now I know Google is doing a lot of searches, but 8 million a day and only 0.4 of a second was what their testing found. Those were some of the links that I came across in my research. 47% of users surveyed want your website to load in under 2 seconds. I'm in that category. If your website takes more than 2 seconds, I'm likely to go away. That's me. I'm impatient, and most of your users are going to be as well. More than 3 seconds. This is another study. 40% of those visitors are going to go away and not come back. And that came from this link right here. I didn't, since I had so little time to prepare, I didn't redo the research and make sure these links were still working, so I'm sorry if they don't still work, because that's another problem with the web is sometimes links go away and it's really annoying. Okay, so the bottom line is this. People are impatient, and they're more impatient than ever. So users of your website or your client's websites are more impatient than they have ever been. And if your site doesn't load quickly, people using the site are going to not want to visit your site, and that's a problem. And we're professionals, right? That's what we do. I assume everybody in this room has something to do with building websites, because we're here at an Expression Engine conference, and Expression Engine is for building websites. So the best way to communicate your professionalism is to build fast websites. You should build your sites with speed in mind. You should not When you're building a site and you get done with a feature or a page or whatever it is you're working on, it should be fast. And that was the bullet point for what I was just saying. Another reason you want fast websites is SEO. This really matters in SEO, and it matters more and more as Google continues to tweak their algorithm. It's very secret sauce, and they don't talk about it, but we do know, based on our poking around with Google's SEO, that Google factors, and they've even said they factor the page speed into the SEO. So if your page doesn't load quickly, then you're going to fall off the front page of Google. If you manage to get there, you're not going to stay there long if your website doesn't load quickly. And of course, mobile usage comes into play here. And this was as of 2016. I'm sure the stats have only increased. Mobile internet surpassed desktop usage as of 2016. So people with these supercomputers in their pockets, there may be fast computers in their pockets, but the networks they're on are often slow. And especially here in Nashville, I know peak times of the day, rush hour, things like that, when you're trying to get Google Maps to load, everybody's accessing that data, and sometimes the carrier's pipes are not big enough to feed all that data to all the people, so people are accessing things on slow networks. And so if your site is serving lots and lots of content and it's taking a lot of time to load, well, you have a problem with your mobile users. So mobile is huge. Like I said, mobile networks can be a slow experience, and you don't want to slow it down even more by serving a lot of content they don't need or by having things be unperformant. So we're going to talk about how to make your site fast because of these reasons. And so we're going to start with expression engine performance. Feel free to laugh. It's okay. And we're going to start with the basics. The channel entries tag, while it is probably the most commonly used tag, is also probably going to be the heaviest tag that you use because it's doing a lot of heavy lifting. And so we need to think about ways that we can minimize the work that it's doing or increase its performance. And so one of the ways that we can do that is we can put it and make sure we don't put it in a loop or a looping embed. So try to use the channel entries tag as little as possible and not do it. If you do it in loops, you're compounding your performance problems. And you definitely want to try to use the disable parameter as often as possible for whatever you can. It is very rare, at least in a lot of the sites that I build, on a lot of pages, you're not going to need categories. So you can completely disable the queries and the results for categories in the channel entries tag. If you do need to get categories, very often you don't need the custom fields that come with categories, and so you can disable category fields. If you need to use a channel entries tag to just get a title or a date or anything basically on the channel titles table, if you're familiar with the schema, you can disable custom fields, and that's going to reduce the weight of that tag by a lot. It is very rare that you need member data, at least in the sites that I build. You can disable that, and very often, if I look at a channel entries tag and it doesn't have disable member data, that's probably a mistake, and so I put it on there. Pagination, again, like single entry pages, things like that, you don't need the queries and the logic that's doing the pagination, so you can disable that and get some performance there as well. And so this is a performance check that sometimes I will, before I push a site out or push a new feature out, I will go through the templates and I will look and make sure that I've disabled everything I can on all the channel entries tags. Anything that you're not using, you should disable. And if you may be missing an opportunity for optimization if you've got a channel entries tag and you haven't disabled anything on that tag. It's rare that that happens for me. So I mentioned loops and looping embeds, and I want to clarify a few things in relation to that. There's a lot of, this kind of knowledge that people have built up over the years about how loops work in Expression Engine. And the fact is, I went straight to the source when I developed this talk. I talked to Kevin, I talked to Derek, and I talked to the people on the team. And embeds themselves are not that expensive. It doesn't cost a lot to just put the code in there that embeds another template into your current template. But, however, what you can do, what loops enable you to do, can sometimes be a performance cost. They can cost you performance. And the reason is this. If you're using embeds, for instance, to get around nested channel entries. And what happens, let's say you have a channel entries loop, a tag that has maybe 20 iterations. And then you embed another channel entries tag, and that's going to loop through. And let's say that's 20 iterations. Well, now you have 20 times 20 is 400. And all of a sudden, you've compounded your performance problems. In addition to calling that tag multiple times, you're also performing lots of queries in the back into the database. And so that's a lot of overhead. And so embeds, again, embeds themselves are not that expensive, but what it sometimes enables you to do and the reason you might be using it may be expensive. And so maybe there's a better way to architect whatever it is that you're doing. Tag caching. This is one that is very often overlooked from the sites that I've inherited or even sites that I built myself. Let me get the bullet point up here. Any tag that starts with exp : has caching built into it. That's an expression engine feature. And you can use the cache yes parameter, and you can give it a refresh in minutes. And that's how long that the contents of that tag will be cached for. And this is usually something you would use on a tag pair, although I believe it will also work on a single tag. I don't remember that for sure. I know it works on tag pairs. And so you can put the cache yes parameter on there, and so when you hit that and the cache is stale, it'll generate the content of it into cache, and then it will not actually load, it will continue to load that content from cache until it expires. So if a tag fetches the same data for every visitor, you should definitely use the cache parameter on tags. You obviously can't use it for dynamic data that's different per visitor, but if it is the same data for every visitor, you should definitely be caching it. And that's the bullet point for what I was just saying. I do that sometimes to get ahead of myself. And so again, like I do with the other parameter that I mentioned, sometimes I'll go through my templates and say, am I missing any opportunities to optimize this tag by caching it? Is it getting the same data for every visitor? Okay, so make sure that you're utilizing the cache parameter on your tags. Here's one that you probably can't use very often, but it is an option, so I wanted to bring it up, and that is dynamic channel query caching. You can't use future or expiring entries or random entries if you enable this, and this is a site-wide enabling, but it caches dynamic channel queries so that it reduces the weight of those queries in the future. And if you have a really simple site, this may be something you can use to optimize. And again, I developed this presentation last year, so that's a screenshot from EE3. Please forgive me, Ellis Lab team. So yeah, you might be able to use this. I don't often find I can use it, but if it's a really simple site, you might be able to use that. And then here's one that, again, is often overlooked, and that is whole template caching by page, by URL. You can go to the template in the control panel, and you can select enable caching, and you can select a refresh or type in a refresh interval in seconds. 60 is often a good number, so it caches it for, it's not seconds, minutes. So it caches it for 60 minutes. You can type any number in there you want. And so what happens is when Expression Engine encounters a URL with that tag that is cached and it already has the cache for that URL, it will get that content from cache and will not go and build that whole page out with the queries and tags and things. So it gets that content from cache. And so that can be, there was a specific site that has a lot of traffic on the 4th of July, and I came into the company it was a couple months before 4th of July, and then I'm responsible for all these new websites that I don't know anything about, right? And this site is getting this massive amount of traffic, and it starts going down. It's unresponsive. We're getting all kinds of 500 errors, and eventually MySQL crashes because it's overloaded. What do we do? Well, the first thing I did is I was able to restart everything and get the thing running again. And quickly, before the traffic overwhelmed it again, I went into the control panel and I started enabling caching on the templates that I knew were not unique data per visitor. And that immediately kept the site from going down. We were able to get past 4th of July and then re-architect some things. So that was a real lifesaver for me to know there. And again, it's something you can do if you know that a template is always fetching the same data for every user. So here's kind of the order of attack. Disable unneeded queries on the channel entries tag. Use tag caching whenever possible. Possibly you can use dynamic channel query caching on simple sites. And use that template full page caching whenever possible. And this is a link to the caching documentation on expressionengine.com if you want to read more about all the caching available. I'm obviously only hitting the high levels. But there is one more form of caching I want to talk about, and that is full page static caching. And this is used in place of that template caching that we were just talking about. And I use Stash to do this. What Stash will do when you utilize the static caching is it will take the entire generated content of the page and write it to a file on the server. And you can use config options to specify where that file goes. So you generate that file, and once that cache is warmed up for that particular URL, you set up Apache or Nginx to look for that file before it goes to Expression Engine. And so it's literally at that point, once you've generated that content, it's not even firing up Expression Engine. It's looking for that static cache file first, and if it exists, it will serve it instead of going to Expression Engine to get that content. And this is super fast. Surprisingly, or unsurprisingly in reality, web servers are optimized to get a file from the disk and serve that content. Like, that's what web servers do best, and it is extremely fast. And so, like with other options, you can only do this if your page serves the exact same content for every user. This is often a lot more pages than you think. Very often we're building sites that are not dynamic in nature. We're brochure sites or those sorts of things. And those are the sites that need to be fast for people visiting, landing pages, things like that. And so when you have a static cache in place and you're serving purely static pages, they can be super fast. And the bonus is you can serve a lot more users on one server with a lot less resource overhead and not have to worry about performance that way. And a lot of the websites that I build, for instance, if you go to eeconf.com, it is statically cached. It is a single page website, and there's a lot of data on that one page that Expression Engine has to get. And so the load time for that page when you hit Expression Engine, I couldn't get it under 2 seconds. It's about 2.5. But if you go there, it's going to load much more quickly than that. And that's because of static caching. Because once that request has happened once, that data has been cached to that cache file, and the server serves that. And so Expression Engine never even gets touched. So here's some testing that I did with the static cache method. I did a fairly simple EE page template, and I used the Apache benchmark tool, which is basically a tool that you can use to run a lot of concurrent requests. And I used a typical, what we call lemp stack. It's Nginx, MySQL, and PHP on DigitalOcean. It was a $10 droplet at the time, if you're familiar with DigitalOcean. $10 droplets are actually more resources than they were in 2017. They upped the specs on those. But in 2017, I don't remember what the exact specs were. But it was a fairly standard DigitalOcean droplet. Not cached, Expression Engine did fairly well on this little droplet. 500 concurrent requests, and I started to see some slowdown. But it was still serving. With static cache, I couldn't really get it to slow down. I got over 2,000 requests and I quit because it's just serving that HTML file and it's done. So there's a huge difference in what you can serve with static cache versus what you would need in terms of server beefiness to serve that many concurrent requests. Now, why is that? Well, here's the request cycle when you're not statically caching. The server routes the request through index.php. In PHP parlance, that's Expression Engine's front controller, right? And PHP is going to wake up and parse index.php, and of course that pushes everything through Expression Engine, and everything flows into EE, and it parses routes and templates, and it runs database queries and all that stuff. And eventually, and I say eventually, it's fast from our point of view when the server's not under load, but a lot of stuff is happening that PHP and Expression Engine have to do, and eventually PHP will return output, and the web server says, here's your output. That's the request cycle when you're not statically cached. And when you are statically cached, the request cycle is a little different. The server checks if that cache file exists. If it does, great. We'll send that to the browser. And so the request cycle is much shorter. There's a lot less overhead in processing. And with Stash, this is kind of the code that makes this happen. In my master layout, I'll have a conditional that says if I'm requesting a static cache, it goes ahead and runs that tag, exp stash static. And then in the template, you set the layout variable. And here's a picture of eeconf's static cache. There actually is more than one page, but the primary content is all on the index page. So that's the directory that Stash stores that static cache in, and I just set up the web server. This is an Apache version. I'm actually running Nginx on eeconf, but this is how you would get Apache to look at that and find out if that rewrite condition down there with document root, that's how it finds out if that file exists on the server. And this is the exact same thing in Nginx. This is a little closer to what I've condensed it for the purposes of this slide, but this is a little closer to what I'm running on eeconf.com. So that's static caching, and it is extremely helpful in a lot of situations, and it can really reduce the need to have a really beefy server if you have pages that are really intense like eeconf.com. Global content. I can't believe I have to say this, but I have come across many sites, not just one, many sites that I've inherited or that I've had to work on that use multiple channel entries for global content on every page. And this is something you should not do. Kevin Cupp has given me a weird look, like that's a thing. Yeah, it happens. Like people set up multiple channel entries and they call those channel entries in the header or the footer or whatever to get global content. Don't do that. That's extremely expensive and not performant. If you must use a channel entry for global content, do it in one channel entry. But there are better ways. There's my own software, Collective. It's for simple global variables, text fields, and things like that. If you need the full power of field types, you can use low variables. Low variables is awesome. I use it a lot. So that's a much better way to get a more performant, much less queries, much less overhead, global variables available to the entire template, to the entire request. I like to disable all the tracking that Expression Engine offers, and so that's the config item down there to do that. I don't need to log refers, I don't need entry view tracking, I don't need hit tracking, I don't need online user tracking. This is all stuff that we're handling now with stuff like Google Analytics and lots of other tools. And what we really want to do is minimize writing to the database, because writing to the database is much more expensive than reading from the database. So when you disable all tracking, you're not writing that stuff to the database, and so you're going to have a lot more performance that way. Here's some more easy wins. Do not put CSS and JavaScript in Expression Engine template files. Don't serve those files as Expression Engine templates. CSS and JavaScript files are static assets. They're files that should be on your server, and as we talked about, your web server is it's optimized to serve these files. Whereas if you put CSS files and JavaScript files and you run that through Expression Engine's template parser, you're incurring a lot of overhead you don't need. Those are static assets, and you shouldn't need to go through PHP to get those. What was I going to talk about here? Oh, use the template profiler. This is, again, something that I even often forget to do, but this can be very helpful to see how many queries you're running on your page, to see where the performance problems might be. So the profiler is something you can enable and look at that if you're logged in as a super admin and you enable it in the config. You can get this handy-dandy template profiler. This is the EEConf 2017 homepage. And you can see it's a lot of queries going on, but I managed to get it under 100 for as much as is going on that page. So the template profiler is a great tool to figure out what's going on with your templates and where your bottlenecks might be. And finally, for Expression Engine performance, pagination. I've done a lot of testing with this because I've had some sites that have come to me and they're having performance problems, and I start finding out, well, maybe I literally had one site where they set limit 999999, and as the site grew, that started becoming really unperformant because they wanted all the entries on one page, which A, maybe don't do that, but B, even if you want to do that, at some point that becomes untenable. And so if you have to get all those entries on page, maybe do some lazy loading with Ajax to get the rest of that content as you start to scroll down. Not a fan of that either, but that's a much better way. And the strange thing that happens is if you try to get, say, 500 entries, it takes longer to get those in one request than it does to get 100 at a time and then Ajax load them in. You can actually do that much faster than waiting on one page to load. So watch your pagination and make sure that you're not doing crazy limits and stuff like that. And if you have to do a lot, get them in batches with Ajax. So that's Expression Engine performance. I want to talk about server performance. And the reason is because EE performance, you need to do it and it's good, but it can be almost meaningless if your server is slow and it doesn't process PHP very quickly. So here's some areas that servers can be inefficient in. Disk I/O, that's a big one. You got a lot of disk I/O going on, and you don't have an SSD. That is a performance bottleneck that can happen. Server load, obviously, if you have lots of users on a server, that can be an area of inefficiency and bottlenecking. Older versions of PHP, we've made huge leaps in performance in PHP over the last couple of years. So older versions of PHP are very inefficient compared to newer versions. Inefficient Apache or Nginx configurations. Using vanilla MySQL, there are better alternatives out there, drop-in replacements for MySQL that are much quicker and have much better performance. So I want to focus in on each of these. Disk.io, it's 2018. Choose a host with SSDs if you can. These will get you the biggest wins. You should disable access logs in Apache and Nginx. If you're having a problem, you can always re-enable them so you can look at them and see what's going on. But these are writing things to the file system, and so if you can disable them and get away with that, you can gain some performance there. Shared hosting. If you're going to choose shared hosting, and this is very common for budgetary reasons, choose a host that does not overload their servers. Nexus does a pretty good job of this. I've used Nexus a lot, and I've never seen them overload their servers, so they're one of our sponsors. Use them. But yeah, they actually do a pretty good job of not overloading shared hosting. And believe me, I've been on shared hosts that do not care how many tenants are on a shared server, and that can get pretty messy. And before Nexus was a company, I used hosts that did this, and it was bad. When I did some research in 2017, I haven't used A2, but I've heard good things about them, and they do advertise that they use SSDs, and I have friends who like A2. Also, I've heard good things about SiteGround, and they also use SSDs. Now, I wrote this with Rackspace Cloud in mind. I didn't write this with Nexus Cloud in mind, but I usually, when hosts start talking about their cloud platform, to me that signals like, for instance, Rackspace Cloud, they're really slow. Don't use Rackspace Cloud. I really like DigitalOcean. I run a lot of sites on $10 DigitalOcean droplets, and that does require more elbow grease, and it does mix dev and DevOps, right? I do both. I do dev and I do DevOps, so not taking Josh Ward's advice, and that's probably to my detriment, but I enjoy both. If you don't want to do a lot of DevOps, there are tools like Forge and Server Pilot that will go out there and configure your droplet, or if you're using what's the other one? Not DigitalOcean, but Linode, stuff like that. It'll configure a couple of different options. Forge will. I don't know as much about Server Pilot. I have at this point rolled my own custom configured box for Expression Engine. I've tweaked things and got it just right, the way I like for Expression Engine to run. So that's an option as well. And this is a little outdated because I'm moving towards Docker now, but that's a little beyond the scope of this conversation. Droplets have dedicated resources, and I usually run one droplet per site. Rarely will I put more than one site on a droplet, and this has some downsides, but it mostly has upsides. If a site has a huge influx of traffic, it doesn't affect any of our other client sites. This is an old screenshot, but it still holds true. It's a lot of server you can get for $10 on DigitalOcean. I use Nginx, PHP 7, and MariaDB. And these are more performant. For instance, Nginx is more performant than Apache out of the box, and in general, in my experience. PHP 7 has as much as 70% increased performance over PHP 5.6. And the performance only keeps increasing. We're on PHP 7.2 now. I'm still running PHP 7.1 on most of my servers, but PHP 7.2 has even more performance than 7.1, which had even more performance than PHP 7. So huge improvements in PHP performance in the last few years. MariaDB is a drop-in replacement for MySQL that scales much better than MySQL. MySQL actually has better performance under light load, but as soon as you start putting it under load, MariaDB just blows MySQL out of the water. And of course, Derek is he's not here, but he's a big proponent of Percona, and I've not used it, but I've heard good things about Percona. Nginx was built in 2002 to handle large amounts of traffic as a response to Apache, which was poorer at handling traffic at the time. Apache's made huge leaps in more recent modern times, but Nginx was built for performance, and I find it generally more performant than Apache. And the big reason for this, as far as I can tell, and this is me reading mostly. I don't get into the code of Nginx, obviously. I'm a PHP developer, but Nginx does not allow for on-the-fly configuration. That's what we call HT access in Apache. And this is a feature, not a bug, because Apache with HT access, well, I have slides for this actually. If you're using Apache, you should disable HT access. And if you don't, what happens is Apache searches through every directory in the chain that you are running through to get to your site. That includes stuff above the public directory. And it searches through that hierarchy for HT access files. And if it finds one, it applies those configuration rules. Then it goes down another level, and if it finds another one, then it has to reconfigure. And if it finds another one, it has to reconfigure. So it's configuring Apache on the fly. And so you should disable HT access so it doesn't even look for those, and so you don't even have that as an option. and then put all your htaccess rules in the vhost file. Now, if you don't have access to the vhost file, like with shared hosting, this could be a problem. But if you can, this is what you should do, because configuring Apache on the fly slows it down, and you can get much closer to Nginx's performance if you do this. Oh, and this is an example of putting your htaccess directives in the virtual host file. It's all the same language. You put all the same stuff in there, and you put it in the little directory tag. I need to get moving. So a lot of slides. You need to be using HTTP2 at this point. This is a technology that's a few years old now, and it is backwards compatible with HTTP 1.1, so there's no reason not to use it. It does require SSL, but this is also a good thing. We should be securing our websites in 2018. And Let's Encrypt, if I could speak, makes SSL really easy, and it's free. HTTP2 capable servers and browsers use a single connection to load multiple resources. So this is one of the huge speed improvements, so it doesn't have to renegotiate a connection for every resource. It has multiplexing, multiple requests over at the same time over the same connection. Binary communication between browser and server, which is much faster. Header compression, and a lot more. Those are just some of the highlights of HTTP2. And it's really easy to enable if you have any access at all to Apache. You can just load in the module and tell it down there in the protocols to use H2 and to fall back to HTTP 1.1 if the browser doesn't support HTTP2. And it's just as easy with Nginx if you have 1.9.5 or newer. We're at like 2.12 now or something like that with Nginx. So it's been out for a while, and it's really easy to enable just with that line HTTP2 on the listen. Again, I mentioned PHP 7 has much greater performance, and EE3 has been compatible with PHP 7 since 3.1.0. EE2 has been compatible with PHP 7 since 2.11. You shouldn't even be using EE2, but it is compatible with PHP 7. I still have sites on EE2, I'm kidding, but only a little. 3.5 brought compatibility to PHP 7.1, and obviously EE4 is going to have compatibility with 7.1. Again, I wrote this in 2017. PHP 7 is really fast, and I've seen tangible speed improvements just by switching from PHP 5.6 to PHP 7. So it's not a little bit of speed improvements. And I know that it's not a replacement for well-performing development and keeping expression engine performant, but I have taken poorly performing sites that probably could have been written better for performance and really improved them by moving to PHP 7 because of the optimizations there. MariaDB or Percona. MariaDB is up to 266% faster, measured at 220 concurrent connections with query cache enabled on multi-threaded hardware, which is most hardware these days. I couldn't find stats on Percona when I did this research, but again, I hear it's very fast and stable. And again, both of them blow vanilla MySQL out of the water. Make sure that you have query cache enabled if you're managing your own server. That is a huge optimization, and there's no reason not to enable it. This is one that I find, this is basically a premature optimization, using a separate database server from your web server. And it is necessary under certain circumstances with huge websites. I'm not going to pretend it's not necessary, but it's not necessary as often as I see it. And it immediately increases latency between your web server and your database server. So you've already introduced a lag time there. So you need to make sure it's really necessary before you do it, and then you need to tune it really well. And most of us don't need to do that. I have not yet had a need to do that, and I've built some pretty big sites. It sounds like great advice, right? You have PHP running on one server and you have MySQL running on the other, and so you separate the load. But in practice, again, it introduces those latency issues, and there are almost always better optimizations you can and should be making. So in my opinion, again, this is my opinion, but this is the one I'm the one doing the speaking. This is a premature optimization that you almost always don't need. And again, clearly, a lot of this is more applicable if you have a lot more control over your server, and Nexus will handle that for you, of course, as Josh Ward pointed out. But I like to get my hands dirty with the server stuff. So these are some of the best practices that I recommend for servers if you're managing, or for whatever level of access that you have to that. So I want to talk now about PageSpeed. And yes, a score of 100 on Google PageSpeed is possible. I used to believe it wasn't, but I got there. And so I want to tell you how to do it. Now, I know EEConf is not quite at 100 this year. I think 2017's was because knew I was giving this presentation in 2017. EEConf 2018 is not quite at 100, but it's close. I think what's getting me right now is I don't have my image optimization set just right, but it's pretty good. So I want to walk through a few of the rules that you will see when you run Google's PageSpeed Insights, and it'll say, hey, you should do something like avoid landing page redirects. What does that mean? Well, first of all, redirects take more time because they require more HTTP requests, and they have DNS lookup and TCP handshakes and TLS negotiations and all this overhead. And so when you redirect, you're incurring overhead and slowing the user down. And that's bad for mobile especially. And it's especially bad like when you're trying to redirect a user who comes to yoursite.com and you want to go, oh, no, you need to be on the mobile subdomain. Like, don't do that. Just don't do that. That's ridiculous. And it's penalizing your mobile users because you're redirecting them away from a site they've already started to load, and their browser has already negotiated that connection. And so you're redirecting them away, and it makes the mobile experience very bad. It's probably not as big a deal on desktop, but you still shouldn't do it. And Google PageSpeed Insights will often say, eliminate render blocking JavaScript. What the heck is that? Well, this one is a little tricky to achieve, particularly for sites that already exist that you weren't thinking about this at all, and you coded it expecting certain things to be available, and you weren't thinking about asynchronous JavaScript at the time. So we'll start with CSS. Without Critical CSS, it will lead to an unstyled page if you load it after the page is loaded, right? So without Critical CSS, the page loads and it's all unstyled, and then after the page loads, you load in the CSS asynchronously, and then you get a styled page. Well, this is less than optimal. So we need to talk about Critical CSS. Critical CSS is for content that is above the fold, and I hate that term, but it is relevant here. And that just means content you can see right away before you scroll. And that CSS will be inserted directly into the head of the page so that it's available immediately. And it's only the CSS we need to display what's in the head, what's in the viewport. At the time, I'm not using Grunt anymore. I've kind of changed my build process, but all this stuff is still applicable no matter what build process you use. And so I was using Grunt Critical. I run a script on my servers. EEConf is actually still using Grunt, but it checks every minute to see if Critical needs to run. And the way I did is I checked for the existence of a file on disk, and my process will write that file when it has finished. And my deployment process will delete that file so it knows every time I deploy to run Grunt Critical again to make sure the Critical CSS exists for every page. And also, if I save an entry, I have an extension that deletes that file as well. And I have a sitemap with every URL on the site, and so it just goes through that sitemap, and the process generates Critical CSS for every page. So we've generated with that process, that high-level overview of that process, we have Critical CSS files on the disk for every page. Now we need to load them if they exist. And because I'm an add-on developer, I wrote a little add-on. I don't think I released it publicly, but I wrote an add-on that does this. I think it is on my GitHub repo. I'll have to look. And I called it read file contents, and I just look for the existence of that file, and I use the current path of the URL, and I get that file, and I output it right in the head of my document. And if for some reason that critical file doesn't exist for that URL, then I just load the style sheet in, because I'd rather my users not see the unstyled content. And we now need to load in, and this is a lot to take in. There's a repo with examples that you can look through more closely. But basically what this code does is if the critical CSS exists, then it knows we need to load in the styles in a deferred manner with JavaScript after the page is loaded. And if not, then we just don't do it. And so deferring JavaScript is actually a little easier, but you have to write your JavaScript in such a way that it knows that your dependencies may not be available yet. And you do it with this async tag. So you can see the example above is render blocking. What that means is when the browser is parsing your HTML and it encounters a script tag that does not have the async property on it, it has to stop, load in that JavaScript, parse that JavaScript, and run it, and then it will continue rendering the page. That's called render blocking. So both of those tags above are render blocking. Now down here on the bottom with the async parameter right after the opening of the script tag, that means that the browser will not stop and wait. It will just continue loading it in the background. Now the problem with this is, if you're depending on jQuery, for instance, it may not be available. You can't count on when it's available because it's being loaded asynchronously. So your JavaScript, your custom JavaScript where you're using jQuery, may be loaded before jQuery is ready. And so using the $sign to select a class and add a class or whatever you're doing with jQuery has the potential to fail because jQuery has not been loaded yet. So how do we fix this problem? This is how I fix the problem. I actually still use this exact method. If jQuery has not yet been applied, if it's still undefined, or you can do this with any other dependency as well, then you just wait a minute. You put everything in a custom function. You wait a minute, and then you run try to run that function again. And when your dependencies become available, then the rest of the script will run. So you have to build your JavaScript with asynchronous architecture in mind. You should enable compression on your web servers. This is something that PageSpeed Insights recommends. All modern browsers accept Gzip responses. And gzipping the average web page, your HTML, CSS, JavaScript, it can save you as much as 70% and reduce the size of your page load. And there's a relatively small amount of processing power that is required on the server to gzip that content and then on the receiving side to unzip it. But the savings is far more significant than the cost, so it is something you should definitely do is enable gzip compression. And this is how you do that with Apache. You should, again, do this in your vhost file, but you can also do it in htaccess if you don't have that kind of access. And so there's a code snippet that does that. Again, these are available in the repo that goes along with this presentation, which I will share with you at the end. This is the way you do it in Nginx. It's just similarly as easy. You just tell it which content types you want to gzip, and you turn it on. PageSpeed Insights also recommends leveraging browser caching, and all this really is cache control and e-tag headers that say to the browser, once you have this asset, please cache it and don't ask me for it again until it expires. And so what that means is you load the page once and then you have most of the assets that you need and you don't need to request that down over the... This is really beneficial for mobile networks and phones. You don't need to request that resource again for a while. So you should definitely be enabling cache control headers. Again, here's an example with Apache. Expires by type, I'm basically just adding expires by type to all my images, MP4s, CSS, JavaScript, font files, and I'm saying keep those things and don't ask me for them again for 1 month. And you use a location block in Nginx, but it's a similar concept. You give it a max age. You have to do it in seconds, I think. I think that's seconds. I always have to look it up. Google PageSpeed Insights also recommends optimizing images, and this is the one I struggled with the longest to get to 100. This is PageSpeed Insights' biggest gotchas. I have yet to find add-ons and PHP tools that do this as well as I want it to. I found there are PHP tools out there that help. You can get your page speed score higher, but it'll still say, your image could be optimized better. And so I've been using the ImageMagick Convert command line tool. I'm sorry, it's the command line, but it's the best results I've been able to get. And I have a script that will use that tool, and it goes through basically, I pointed at a directory, and it goes through all the images in that directory and checks if they've been optimized, and if they haven't, it runs the command. This is the command that I run on eeconf.com. It takes the file input, you give it a whole bunch of parameters, which I looked up because I don't understand half of those. And then I found ones that didn't mangle the file very much, but reduced the size a lot. And then I output the file down there at the bottom. And so that's how the command line ImageMagick tool works, the convert tool. PageSpeed Insights will say, minify your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Well, thankfully, this is relatively easy. Minification removes all non-meaningful white space in your document, such as tabs, spaces, line breaks, etc. And this will usually only save you about 5%, but it's worth doing because it's easy to do. So minification of JavaScript and CSS, I do at build time with my dev process when I'm building the site. Again, I was using Grunt at the time. I've got a purely NPM build now. But again, like James said earlier, they're just tools. Use the one that works best for you. Gruntless and Grunt Sass both include options to minify in their configuration. Grunt Uglify, well, it's a tool. It minifies a JavaScript, and that's what I was using at the time. And there are plenty of tools out there that do this. So you should minify those at build time. That's the way I recommend doing it. I have an add-on called Marksman, and that will minify the HTML output of Expression Engine. You can find it on my GitHub repo right there at that URL. So that minifies all the HTML and removes the non-meaningful white space. So here we are. We're getting to the end of my presentation. I want to talk about what we have learned, because I covered a lot of ground and I talked really fast. So hopefully I'll help you remember. We talked about why performance is important. And the biggest one to me, the reason it's important is because of user experience. User retention, you want your users not to be upset with you and leave your site because it's not loading. So user retention is a big one. You should do it because you're a professional and you make fast websites. SEO is a big factor, and mobile devices and networks, of course. You don't want to be the bottleneck there, basically. And then we talked about how to accomplish this with expression engine performance. You don't want to put heavy tags and queries in loops. You want to use the disable parameter on channel entries tag. Use tag caching whenever possible. Possibly you can use dynamic channel query caching to reduce your query load. You want to use template page caching if possible. Or you could use a stash to do static full page caching to an HTML file. Don't use multiple channel entries for global content. Disable tracking, entry views, general database rights, and page views. Don't use templates for static content like CSS and JavaScript. Put those in their own files that are on the server as separate files. Use the profiler to track down heavy duplicate queries and bottlenecks and things like that. And use pagination appropriately and properly, and don't try to load in hundreds and hundreds of entries at the same time in the page request. Server performance, if you're using shared hosting, and that's, a lot of times we don't have the budget to do anything else, then you need to choose your hosts carefully. Try to use hosts that use SSDs because it's 2018. We don't like spinning disks, they're slow. DigitalOcean droplets are amazing if you don't mind a little elbow grease. Use Nginx if possible because it's more performant than Apache. Disable htaccess if you are using Apache if you can. Use HTTP2, use PHP 7, and use MariaDB or Percona. And then we just talked about PageSpeed. You need to avoid landing page redirects, and eliminate render blocking JavaScript and CSS. Enable Gzip compression. Set future expires headers on static assets. Optimize your images, minify your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Does anybody have any questions for me? Yes?
Are you using those, WebP images yet?
I have started to dabble with WebP. I've been a little slow to take that up, slower than I should. I should be looking more at WebP. As far as I know, right now, Chrome is the only major browser to really support WebP, but Chrome is a big section of users. And I have a client that really wanted to start looking at WebP, and so I developed an add-on. I'm not happy with it yet. And honestly, I am probably going to build some WebP conversion tools, maybe, possibly, should I say this? Possibly into Ansel. Maybe, possibly. Do not hold me to this. I don't know yet, but I'm thinking about it. Yes?
So if it only really works in Chrome, you have to offer callbacks?
Yes, so modern browsers support source set on their image tags, and you of course have the picture element, and you can do the whole source set thing, but then you always have the fallback of having an image tag with the source so that older browsers like IE 10 can read it and stuff like that. But then modern browsers will pick up your source set, and so you can give it an image type, image/WebP, so Chrome will pick it up, and then you have the fallback of image/JPEG for other browsers to pick up the JPEG instead. So that's the way you would do that. Other questions? Yes?
About the critical CSS?
Yes.
You were talking about that being part of your build process?
Yes, it's part of my build process.
Is that actually like kind of a tree shaping tip or figuring out what's...
So the way, at least the way that I configured it, and I think there are a lot better ways to do this, but the way I configured it is I gave it what I thought was a reasonable height, and I did full width, and I start mobile first. That's the way I do mobile min width queries, and so I go up. And so I gave it like, I think 1800 wide and I don't know, 1200, I don't remember what it was, but I configured it some way for econf.com. And then so what that does is it says it uses, what's that tool that renders headless web? I can't remember. Anyway, it does all this in the background, the Grunt Critical process. It actually renders out the page, figures out what styles are being used in the visible viewport that you've defined, and then it writes those styles to a file. And then in Expression Engine, with that add-on, I'm looking for the existence of that file and loading it in if it exists.
So is it created two separate CSS files at once?
Right, no, it creates a CSS file per page. Yeah, and so you load that in on every page, and so the CSS may be different on every page. So it's a critical file per page. Yes.
What's your experience with searching for content, site content for across sites?
You mean like a site search of some kind? You're searching for channel entries, content, and stuff, like with low search or something like that?
The front end, what they're reading, not the code.
With reading? I'm not sure I understand the question yet.
Well, something like low search.
Yeah, low search.
It has a little bit of a limitation in some regards, but you use low search.
Sure, yeah, I have several sites I've used low search on. Yeah, and that's where obviously you can't statically cache search results pages because those results can change at any time, and they may be different per user and stuff like that, and you're usually using query strings and stuff like yeah. So it's really hard. You can't cache low search results, and so you have to do other optimizations like making sure that your server is beefy and general things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
If you're doing template caching your static page, do you have to do up the tag caching as well?
I think it's a good practice to do it because it doesn't hurt anything, right? And if for some reason you need to turn caching off on a template or turn off static caching for a page because you discovered some problem or whatever, you still have a level of caching available that you know, like you tested and you knew that this particular tag is loading the same content for everybody, and so you're falling back to levels of caching. So it's like a progressive, it's similar to progressive enhancement. That's the way I look at it. All right, well, I'll be around if you have any other questions. Thank you so much for listening to me babble.